It's 4 o'clock, so we have a great panel of speakers coming today. You may have found in the app, and you may have noticed that I'm in fact not Sue Smith from Imperial in London. I'm Mike Stanley-Baker. I'm a historian. I work at the School of Humanities, and I'm also the lead for the Medical Humanities course here. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Graham Matthews.
Thank you. So I'm just going to very quickly introduce you to my interdisciplinary module that runs here at NTU. This module actually has in it a whole set of fairly innovative assessment methods that are designed to help move from the classroom into getting students to be more civically minded and to develop their work outside of NTU. So this is an interdisciplinary module that explores the literary representation of health and sickness and teaches us that our understanding of illness is not simply determined by physical symptoms, but is also influenced by class, gender, and ethnicity, and determined and perceived differently by patients, practitioners, and policymakers. So on the module, I introduced students to a whole range of contemporary literature and material from the history, sociology, and philosophy of medicine. Teaching and learning are supplemented by a whole set of videos that we did using the tele-initiative All-Star myself. I don't know if you've ever heard yourself, but seeing yourself and hearing yourself at the same time is much worse than that. So I can't bear to watch these things, but students enjoy watching them. I'm sure. I think they watch them on the MRT. Anyway, it's becoming increasingly common to offer a literature module as an elective to medical students, with the rationale that literature helps develop skills in empathy, perspective, communication, and humility. And this is because skills in close reading, hermeneutics, and critical analysis are shown to be beneficial to medical practitioners who are dealing with very, very complicated stories. We find that patients have very, very difficult telling tasks, and medical practitioners have very difficult listening tasks. The module here is distinctive, though, because it's primarily for literature students. It's run in Singapore, and it's supposed to offer pathways to public engagement beyond the classroom. So the key assessments on the module include a graphic, a concept map, an essay. The students won't ever get rid of the essay. They're lit students, so how traditional in that respect, and a creative project. And I've had to design a bespoke marking scheme to fit this, which uses the Solo taxonomy. The first one of the assessments is the graphic, and this is very much inspired by the emerging subdiscipline of graphic medicine. There's actually a tremendous array of graphic novels that have been published about health and sickness, and since 2009, all the medical students at Penn State College of Medicine have been creating comic strips as part of their training, and do the same here. And I was also delighted to learn that there's a doctor in Singapore who's also been doing the same thing for the last few years. So for this task, students are asked to take a concept from medical humanities and relate it to a real-world issue of urgent concern. This is the student who did the design on this one. She has actually, since graduation, become an actual designer. She recently did the cover art for Chian's memoir, Illness Narrative, Programmatic Circle. So basically what it's doing is it's training students to consider the application of theoretical concepts to a real-world scenario, and it shows how the skills of the humanities scholar actually does relate to an issue of urgent concern. There's a whole range of subject matter here. For the creative project, it has a very straightforward brief. Students have to make a link between literature and medicine, which starts off very difficult, but by the end of the course is no problem, and relate this to a non-specialist audience. Okay, someone who's not medically trained, someone who's not trained in humanities, and they come up with a whole array of different forms. So some of them make posters, some of them make films using their iPhones, some of them do like installations and displays and exhibitions and all these sorts of things. And I was so impressed with this work initially that we held an exhibition at the HSS Library just to show some of the work up. So I can give you some examples of some of the projects we had. So Biosphere is actually a hand-painted set of clay models in the shape of various human body parts, including the heart, kidneys, and eyeballs. And these are then presented in wrapped polystyrene trays similar to supermarket meat products and furnished with barcodes. And the project itself is a comment on the commodification of body parts and the ways in which economics problematize healthcare services. This is another one called Well Cult, which deliberately imitates the website of Goop.com. Have you heard of this? Goop, so named as Gwyneth Paltrow's website, a GP, and she learned somewhere that if a website is going to be successful, it should have 2 O's in it, like Google or Yahoo, so Google, and also Google. So it's got that kind of double meaning there. But basically, this brand started as a weekly email newsletter that provided new age advice such as police your thoughts, eliminate white foods, and popularize the slogan, nourish the inner aspect. So that this particularly well-researched research project, the students actually parody her forms. The website's designed to look like her website, but it actually debunks the false information that she gives. Okay, I'm being waited for 5 minutes already. The other projects we've got are things like interpretive dance, where students are actually trying to demonstrate the problems with diagnosing mental illness, and this is a real issue in Singapore. Sufferers often face a great deal of stigma. And this is the worst project. The reason this is the worst project is not because of the form, it's a video game, so the students really have excelled themselves in that respect. It's the worst project because it stars a character called Graham, like me, and the character dies at the end. So I'm not sure what I'm trying to say to the game. But it shows the sort of the wide variety of things that students can do and they can achieve. We then took this a step further, and we worked with the university's community engagement initiative. We did an exhibition at NTU and did a set of talks with both me and my students to show some of the excellent work that we do in medical humanities and reach out to a wider variety of people. We've gone a step further in this week, in fact. The Singapore Writers' Festival is the largest arts festival in Singapore. It attracts 25,000 people every year, spread over 10 days. Medical Humanities Cluster sponsored 3 different events, and you see this here. And we actually managed to fill the entire room. One of these was actually set in the old Parliament building, so it's actually, these are people who are coming to see academics talking about their research, not just famous writers. I just lost it. Okay, but some of the projects that my students have done, we actually managed to get funding to develop these and grow these into full-scale projects. I will show you this one because it's this one. It's worth the time cost. Okay, so like this one here. So this actually started as a very small kind of box design, the idea being that new medical technologies allow us to see the body in progressively new, more insightful ways, but it also risks distancing doctors from their patients and not seeing them in quite the same way. So this project is one where the original one was about this size, and the idea is that you could see through different levels there. And on the much larger scale thing, this is bigger than me, taller than me, it actually grabs an audience in a much more interesting way. There's 2 more of these projects. There's Cube, which is all about the metaphors that we use to talk about health and sickness, which actually lights up on the insides. It's quite an imaginative piece. And then Grief, which invites people to share stories of sickness and suffering. It collects together personal, subjective narratives from those that are published. I also work with my students and a graphic artist in Singapore to develop the graphic assessment into a set of workshops for people in the town. And this is open to all members of the general public. We attract about 25 people for each one. And I work with a literary charity to do this. And they tell me that people who come to this are much more engaged, much more interested and energized than they are when it's just a straightforward creative writing workshop. That actually having that focal point on issues to do with health and sickness really does interest people in getting going. Other projects include the use of social media. So my students have, after the module, have developed projects that they've done. This is one where it's using Facebook to bring together people to talk about issues to do with mental health in Singapore. And they've actually, it's even gone full circle where they now have their own reading group as well, which attracts a good number of people each time. There's other kind of proof of concept designs as well for other social media applications, and there's a kind of a general recognition amongst my students that social media offers a great deal of opportunities, but it also carries a great deal of risk, especially when people are sharing intimate and personal stories. So that's been very much a kind of a whistle-stop tour through a whole range of different projects. But the message in brief is that the humanities can speak to issues of urgent concern. They're not just abstract, but they can reach a much wider audience. And one of the things I think would work really well would be if my literature students were working directly with medical students to develop other projects that can work to raise health literacy and reach a wider audience.
minutes for Q&A. Feel free to ask questions.
I think certainly a lot of us are aware of the real benefits medical humanities can bring for the medical students. But one thing I noticed in an increasingly crowded curriculum where everybody's fighting for a place, medical humanities is often sidelined as an elective for a self-serving group of students who are probably already quite empathetic, quite open, and sort of engaging in it. How do we then justify opening this up to actually being within the full curriculum? What would you suggest would be a way to do it?
We're going to speak about that later in the panel, actually.
Okay.
So, yeah, we'll have more to say about that.
I mean, I actually work for the School of Humanities, so I'm not actually affiliated with RKC Medicine at all, so I don't teach medical students, so I have taught some medical students in the UK. So my main focus is on humanities students and demonstrating what they can do. But one of the issues that comes up again and again whenever we're talking about healthcare is often to do with administration and policy, especially when we're talking about the whole, for instance, the idea that doctors only have 5 minutes to treat their patients, and therefore, how can they spend that extra time to learn about the patient's narrative, how can they really engage with them? And our counterclaim to that is basically that greater time spent with the patient means they're more likely to adhere, take the treatment, and that actually works out as more efficient in the long term. But to effect a change like that, it can't just come from doctors. I think that it actually needs to come from the people who are going to go and work in administrative centres and things. And to some extent, that's actually humanities students who go and work there. So this is my kind of thinking, that training humanities students and helping them to get jobs as hospital administrators and working in these areas, that's possibly a way forward.
So this is not medical students that there's...
No, it's lit students.
Oh, sorry.
This is why it's such a shift, because lit students, they all do essays, they read books and write essays, and we need to break them out of just doing that cycle. They should be doing essays, they need to be able to write well in the newspaper, but they can do a whole range of other things as well.
How do you decide the material that's really reading materials? As in, you said you expose them to a range of medical material. How do you decide that?
So I start with the text. So it's usually a literary text that depicts often a doctor-patient relationship, and then it's a selection of reading that fits with that particular theme. So one example might be Gwen Swift wrote a fantastic short story called The Hypochondriac, and that investigates the ways in which doctors perceive their patients. And of course, hypochondria is the kind of the limit case for biomedicine. Like, how do you treat someone who doesn't have any sort of physical manifestation of the disease but is convinced they have one? So it's very much a question about language and communication and engagement there. So then I can bring in a whole range of material that focuses on what hypochondria is and how it's understood and how its whole history.
Time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Oh, really?
You've got 2 minutes.
This was it? Oh.
To get collaboration between your humanities students and medical students.
I think that's the thing that would really elevate the creative projects to the next level. I mean, at the moment, the students are creating projects which are very focused on their own area. So our strengths are in close reading, are in culture. The next step would be to, if you want to, people are serious about developing health literacy and helping to educate the general population rather than just interest them. It needs to have that collaborative element, I think, yeah. But how do you know, I know that students are incredibly busy people, so.
I get the sense that we should probably be far more optimistic about the benefits of AI and algorithms, because if you think about the history of medicine, it's been overwhelmed by fact. I mean, most of the history of medicine was not particularly fact-based. It's then become completely overwhelmed by the fact. And in fact, maybe AI will liberate us to take us back to thinking about what is at the core of medicine. So I think we should be pretty optimistic and encouraging about AI. But I mean, that's just a comment, because then we have space to have these sorts of conversations.
Okay, sure, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So our next speaker today is Kathleen Leedham-Green. Leedham-Green comes from Imperial College, London.
And King's College.
Thank you.
Double across the two places. So, and this is actually on, does this? So I'm presenting with my King's College hat on 2 days a week on behalf of my colleagues Anne Stevenson, who runs the GP education, and Flor Smythe-Sara, who started the clinical humanities movement really and does a lot of work with Harvard. Kate Dunton, who runs the Cultural Institute Educational Outreach, and Professor Brian Hurwitz, our humanities expert. So we at King's, actually what I'm doing is I'm presenting a case study here, and it's almost identical to Graham's thinking in that we're starting with an urgent clinical problem, using participatory approaches, getting students to do a bit of research and express themselves through humanities-based approaches. It is core. 400 students had to do this. So I'm presenting the evaluation, part of the evaluation, and specifically looking at what clinically relevant learning happened. This was our problem. So we have this positivistic education, multiple choices, single best answer, lots of e-learning, one-way communication of information, junior clinical roles that get really good at opening and closing curtains, these rotating placements so no one gets to know you, objective tests and clinical competence, and yet we're all thrown into humanistic clinical practice. Critical thinking is important, team working, working with complex trauma, sometimes these psychosocial determinants of health. I think Gwen and I probably read the same books, same papers, so we were thinking about compassion and resilience, the difference between complexity and super complexity. The complexity, you're getting to somewhere really difficult and there are lots of different paths you can take. With super complexity, you don't even know where you're trying to get to. So medical education is super complex. And of course, Joe Shapiro's work on addressing the discontents. And what was it? So it was situated in a longitudinal primary care placement, so students are in a single GP practice every day, or 1 day a week for a year. Students were briefed to choose a topic of their choice that they were curious about, they were angry about, critical about, something that they weren't learning elsewhere in their education. They had to research the issues, choose their medium of expression, and they were teamed up with both a clinician and a humanities expert to support them in expressing this project. It was a team project, groups of about 8 students. 2 of those students were the project leads. They had 2 practice-based workshops, campus-based workshops with these experts and clinicians, interspersed with dedicated time that was in the curriculum, so we weren't disadvantaging those just about managing students. And some active timetable self-directed sessions to do this as well. This is my logic model for my programmatic evaluation. The purposes, obviously getting this complex metacognitive learning going, our inputs. We had a project done collaboratively with our Cultural Institute. We had 398 students across 50 GP practices, 6 humanities experts who were real educators, teamed with clinicians who were very much into the humanities. And importantly, we had an arts in health toolkit, which I'm very happy to share, which coach students through these processes, in particularly participatory with patients and team members and members of the healthcare team with these processes. As I said, I've been through the processes slightly. The assessments, so they had to produce something, which is a group presentation, that's formative, but every single student had to do a 500-word reflective account of their learning. Whether they learned something or not, they're now to be critical for this. And that's what we've analysed for our evaluation. And the outputs, we had 50 projects. We wanted to inspire, or to motivate at least, excellence rather than good enough. So we had lots of prizes, sponsored prize, about £10,000 worth, which we're going to be distributing over a few years of prizes to give to students. And our evaluation, we looked at student experience, which I'm going to show in a later presentation. Student learning through this, looking at their reflective learning accounts, but also student opinion through student-led focus groups, which has been published separately. So we teamed up with Wendy French. She's a prize-winning, Hippocrates prize-winning poet. Carl Holland, who's done all the GMC graphic designy stuff. Emma Barnard, who's a very critical thinker, looking at surgery. Kate Dunton, who's an art historian who does lots of critical work as well. Angela Maddock, who does lots of therapeutic stuff. And Amanda Clayton, who does exploratory and expressive stuff, thinking about decay, dementia, medicines use, etc. The outputs I won't go into in great depth, but they covered topics like mental health, healthcare equity, patient perspectives, health promotion, social determinants of health, and these practitioner and student well-being. These are the topics the students chose. And the media, and included some really quite creative stuff. So we had social media campaigns around homelessness, we had sculpture around the determinants of health, lots of films giving narratives of students being overworked, some incredible poetry, photography, art, performance even, some narratives. There was a very good prize-winning project where they took all the online patient narratives on our Care Opinion website and converted them into haiku and cartoons. So you could just click through onto these really accessible images of what this patient's story was, and then go through to the narrative beneath. So it's increasing the accessibility of patient narratives. So what clinically relevant learning happened? I'm afraid this is tiny, but one of the things that we saw was there was this emergence of patient-centered conceptions of clinical care, and this sort of admiration for patients, their resilience, their creativity. Think about complexity, the complexity of systems of the body. People are much more than their illnesses. Health does not occur in isolation, social, economic status, etc., etc. Insights into the determinants of health and well-being. So the social, cultural, environmental factors that profoundly impact on health. And that is paramount in the ability and the quality of our response as healthcare practitioners to a diverse population. And this is a very moving account of a student reconnecting with their creative self. I slowly felt I was beginning to lose the part of myself I once held so dear and felt powerless to stop it. Once you lose your confidence, it is so hard to get it back. I'm therefore truly grateful for the Clinical Humanities Project, not only in aiding my future development as a clinician, but also allowing the rediscovery of a place of myself I thought was gone. Wow. Leadership, so these were team projects. This is one of the main things that came up. This emotional intelligence, the leadership, we're talking about group performance, and creating this quite high-class project that this team made. And it's now being exhibited at their GP practice. And I quite like this one on perspective, so being able to step back and look at the bigger picture and how to engage with meaningful discussions with peers and colleagues. And advocacy, thinking about people with mental illness, debilitating illnesses, and being able to step into their shoes through the humanities and becoming an advocate for the vulnerable. And of course, empathy and patient-centeredness, thinking beyond the notes and to understand what's truly important to each patient regarding their health in relation to their lives. And this one, this sort of emergent critical thinking, creative skills, so thinking differently for patient care. And this, the final one almost sort of sums up everything that students learned. I wasn't quite sure where to thematically analyse that one, so I just put it under criticality. So we're trying to use this. We haven't quite got there yet. Going through a process of looking at these again and again to try and hypothesise how clinically relevant learning happens through the humanities. There's something around students choosing their own topics who have this authenticity, and they're able to actually criticise what they see, as opposed to be receptacles of information. Thinking about the humanities support students in thinking in depth about a single issue rather than achieving minimal competency across a whole domain. And there's creativity and complexity that they learn to see that there's more than one perspective on a single issue. And the language they use about transformative learning, of changing their perspective, is quite strong. And so we're looking at what learning. It tends to be the metacognitive and affective domains of clinical learning, and as I said, these transformative learning experiences. That's it, thank you. Any questions? Okay.
I have one very practical one and one more kind of educational one. How much funding did you get to have these artists?
Yeah, so we had,
And
it was
where'd
about
you get funding from?
£4,000. It was the Cultural Institute, so they have a budget every year for promoting culture in other departments across the university. So that was quite lucky. Yeah.
That's a one-off? Or?
Yeah, so we funded the clinicians and the time. That's part of came out of my course, and but the Cultural Institute funded the 6 experts. Yeah.
And then the more kind of education you later on. I mean, these humanities, a lot of them tend to come now, when I've heard from various schools early on. How can we continue this into the later years? Because it seems the learning that's there is really valuable, if not more valuable, later on.
No, I think that is something that needs testing. So we situated this in year 2. The language they're using is transformative language, which means once you've gone through that door, you're not going to go back. We didn't take everyone with us. So it's a purposive sample, so I'm looking at what learning did happen, didn't always happen. But it's once you've gone through that door, you don't go back to the old ways of thinking. So I think you do it year 2, year 3, year 4 if you can. But we're going to be specifically looking at the discontents for a different research project and see if we can analyse what that is. We think it's something to do with conceptions of learning. So if learning is seen as something that's done to you, you're not going to like this. And if you see learning as something to help you pass exams, this isn't going to help you do that. So.
I noticed you had about 50 or so projects. So I'm assuming about 400 students, that's about 8
Yeah,
people.
that's right, yeah. 2 student leads in a group of 8. That they had to write down who was doing what as part of the workshops.
The question is how do you get everybody engaged in that?
Yeah, so everyone had protected sessions to devote to this, and they had to specify, do it as a process task list who was doing what. And they did mostly. I think, yeah, some struggled with that, but mostly did. Very interesting, yeah. So they absolutely loved Cara Holland, the graphic artist, because that was seen as absolutely barnstormingly relevant to clinical practice. I think some of them found the more critical artists, you either love them or hate them. But some of the most engaged students we had, most transformed, I think, were working with those artists. It's a difficult toss-up. Yes, Graham.
I absolutely love these projects. They're
Yeah.
absolutely incredible. But are you going to publish them or display them?
Yeah, so we have a lovely exhibition at Somerset House, which is this beautiful place on the Thames. Partly because King's College owns one of the wings, so we could just throw it in there. But it was absolutely beautiful. And again, you're honouring students' work, that we had proper artists curating this exhibition, so it looked gorgeous. And of course you invite the faculty to come and the students feel proud and dress up. And I think it did a lot to help the sense of valuing students, so valuing their outputs as well, creative outputs.
Okay, so we're going to move on. So let's introduce our next speaker is Giskin Day, who's from Imperial College London, and will be speaking to us about attitudes to gratitude, learning from positive feedback.
I think I will try and project. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah? Thank you. I'm just embarking on this new project, a PhD in the expression and reception of gratitude in healthcare. But I've already started to make connections between my teaching and, of course, all the work one does in the lead-up to actually starting an official research project. Some of you may recognize this from Tan Tock Seng next door, the hospital. They have got these wonderful display boards of all the thank yous expressed to the staff that worked through the SARS crisis. It's really beautifully done. And it's one of the things that inspired me to do this project, to undertake this work. When I came here 5 or 6 years ago, I remembered this very vividly, and I'm delighted to see that it's still there, along with a whole section of the Heritage Museum in the hospital devoted to gifts. So I know from being a teacher, a medical educator, how much I am motivated by the thanks I receive from my students. I'm very lucky that I work in an institution where I feel hugely valued. And some of my colleagues are here today that have been supporting me since I started some 20 years ago at Imperial. I never saw myself as an educationalist. I worked in publishing, and it took me some time to come around to the fact that this is what I love doing, this is my vocation, and to start to see it as a proper career rather than something that was absolutely lovely to do. But it really worries me when I work with medical students that they tend to lose their motivation by the time I see them in year 4. Many of them are having crises of confidence. They're not quite sure whether the career is for them. They are already worrying in anticipation of the issues that they'll come across as medical professionals. And it really strikes me that it's incredibly important, the role that gratitude can play in driving morale. And here's one example from healthcare, just recently on Twitter. The power of a thank you card received today from a grateful patient for boosting morale is immense. So many other patients in the clinic today told me how the department is buzzing. Emotion forms a big part of human factors. And yet our systems are set up in hospitals to focus on complaining. You know, it's comments and complaints. Complaints tend to get escalated and gratitude goes nowhere. It's not seen as actionable. It very rarely makes it to the people for whom it's intended, unless it's informal and kind of happens in a very interpersonal way, which is often not possible in hospitals. Gratitude is a very complex emotion. I'm going to be looking at all of these things in my study, but I'm going to focus today a little bit on the institutional problem that it forms part of. And these are the similarities I've noticed so far between higher education and healthcare when it comes to this. Complaints are escalated, gratitude goes nowhere. Gratitude, it's complex and relational, and often it's tempered by relationships that difference between how you feel about an institution and how you feel about a person. And quite often, you know, that is problematic. People are very appreciative normally of healthcare professionals, but they may have a totally different attitude to the hospital. And the same happens in universities. They may have a particular attitude to a teacher, which is very different to the attitude they have to their course as a whole or to the university. Ethical issues arise. These can't be swept under the carpet. That it's often gratitude is viewed as bribery. In fact, especially in healthcare, there's such strict policies around gift giving and expressions of gratitude that it's often refused, when actually people are probably mostly coming from a very sincere place and not expecting anything in return, and that becomes a problem. Both institutions are increasingly reliant on gratitude in the form of patronage for funding. You know, as the minute you graduate, you start getting those letters about sponsorship and asking for money. And hospitals also have these huge fundraising drives. And the duty, this is really important, the duty of service provision is an obligation, and nobody is ethically obliged to feel grateful for it. We can't expect our students to be grateful. We get paid for teaching them. Patients, are entitled to health care. So there's no ethical obligation. It might be a moral one, might be different. But certainly we can't insist that people are grateful. So how do we deal with this? Well, actually it's an incredibly important problem, or morale is, anyway, because it has to do with patient safety. That it's well proven that the staff experience feeds into patient experience. Happier staff deliver better care. And that is linked in turn to clinical effectiveness, which is linked to patient safety. And gratitude drives a lot of the staff experience. There's a movement towards civility. This is a fantastic, they've got a website and they've got a Twitter handle, Civility Saves. And I think we're starting to see a backlash now against all the nastiness that happens in public life, the kind of, the Twitter storms that go on, and just this general idea that we have to start being kinder to each other. It's such a hostile world out there. There's so many threats that unless we bring things down to the interpersonal relationships, we can all get overwhelmed by anxiety. We can worry about so much stuff. So it all happens in those interpersonal relationships. And here they make a very good case, a really well-argued report, that incivility affects more than just the recipient, it affects everyone, and that unless we are kind and civil in healthcare, actually lives are at risk because it comes down to patient safety. There's this paper called Taking Care of the Hateful Patient. It was written in the 1970s. You would never be allowed to write a thing like this now. But it's actually really interesting, especially when people can be frank in those situations. And the vignettes that the author gives are often connected to how grateful or ungrateful the patient feels. But these kind of categories will not be unfamiliar to those of us in education, especially the entitled demanders. Now that students are paying high fees in the UK, there is that sense of entitlement, and we've got to work out how best to deal with entitled demanders. And there is a certain psychology of gratitude that will also be familiar, I think, to the educators in the room. I just have this story. I actually got this on demonstrating this downstairs. This is a game I developed for reflective practice. And we've got it in the education research area. It was a paired activity. It sent GP trainers off with a bag of props and prompts. And it could only work in pairs. Somebody crashed it, they'd not signed up, and I asked them very respectfully, I thought, if they would mind joining the afternoon session where I find a partner. The feedback I got for that session was fantastic. But of course, what is the one thing I remember? I got asked to leave as odd number of participants, despite other GPs offering to do good work for 3 people instead of 2. Very humiliating. So much for fantastic caring academics being flexible. Made me want to give up undergraduate teaching. And it's just, I battle with this all the time, is that no matter how much good feedback you get, quite often it's that one wounding, I perceive it as a hugely unfair comment that overwhelms your psychology and makes you think twice about these things. And we have to almost train ourselves out of that. We do have to look at the positive, but it's also that those kind of incident informs how I try to give feedback to students now. I've tried to make my feedback far more bespoke, sincere, non-formulaic, constructive, and civil. This is a problem that doctors do. You try and thank them and they say, please don't thank me, I'm just doing my job. But really we can't do this. It's important for people to be able to express their gratitude. It's good for their subjective well-being. And even if you don't feel that you've earned it or that you are just doing your job, that's usually not what people are thanking you for. If you take the time to listen to what they are thanking you for, it's a valuable source of feedback, and you can then pass it on. So I would say that being willing to accept gratitude is important to the well-being of the giver as well as the receiver. So good gratitude is acknowledged and welcomed, recognized as being important, and not met with thanks minimizers, and shared if appropriate. If you need to pass it on to your team, or you can put something on social media, it helps to spread the gratitude, and it doesn't just stop it dead in its tracks. And that's important in institutions. We've got to work out ways to make gratitude flow. With that, I'll say thank you. We should take questions. Hi.
Hi, thank you. There's a really interesting presentation. I had a question about the sort of context of gratitude, and I wondered if you, I know you're just sort of starting this research, and I presume you're maybe looking at the UK, but I wondered if there was the context of gratitude was important. So does gratitude...
Culturally?
Yeah, so both culturally, so does gratitude look differently, different in different countries? And also, I mean, in the sociology literature, there's emerging evidence that the introduction of tuition fees, as you mentioned, has changed students' attitudes towards education and their relationship with it. So has that also changed the sort of gratitude? And
Yes, absolutely. Well, of course, it is hugely culturally specific, and even in the UK, or in London, the different communities have different ways of expressing gratitude. So some GPs tell me that in certain areas, it's customary for their patients to bring food every time they come, and they all have different ways of handling it. Some of which is hugely, I think, detrimental to human relationships, where people are turned away or gifts put in the bin in front of them. There's some horrible stories out there. And interestingly enough, though, my GP friends, because I talk to lots of people about this, tell me that private healthcare, where you pay for it, their patients tend to be much more grateful, which seems like a contradiction. If you've been treated on the NHS, you don't have to pay. But there's one important factor, and that is waiting time. Waiting time absolutely gets in the way of gratitude. If you don't have to wait, you are disproportionately more grateful for being seen. Whereas if you do have to wait, then no matter how well you're treated, and no matter how your GP has had no control over the amount of time you've had to wait, or the specialist or the consultant, that is a huge factor. So I'm starting to try and get a handle on these things. With students, I haven't noticed personally a big difference since students started paying, because it maybe affect other years more. I feel the quality of the experience, the things that students thank me for are things that are outside the curriculum normally. It's for holding their hands when they've had a crisis, or and curating an interesting course for them. That's what they seem to be most grateful for, and for just the offer of availability. So I tell my students they get aftercare for life. They can call on me anytime. I'm always happy to hear from them and help them. Not many of them take me up on that. Some of them, especially when I teach science communication and they want me to read their CVs or whatever, I'm very happy to do that. But just offering that is enough for them to feel incredibly grateful. So I don't think there's a magic formula. I think it is very interpersonal. It depends on you and the way your relationship with students is allowed to develop. You're in class of 300, you've almost got no hope. I feel very privileged that I teach 25 students. I get to know them really well. But I'm interested in all of those factors. So I hope to be able to tell you more in 5 years.
Giskin, I would interpret the private gifting slightly differently. So when I did private obstetrics, everyone would give quite extraordinarily generous gifts after the baby was born. And I assumed, I kind of felt, that it was an effort to change the relationship from a commercial one to a relational one.
Yes.
So there was a discomfort after the bill had been paid. The thing had become a commercial exchange. And then it was re-establishing the fact that it was a human one.
Well, that's really interesting, yes.
And I don't think that happens so much in the non-fee paying thing, where there is no moment when you move from a relational to a commercial. So I'd be interested in other health sectors that have commercial writ large.
Absolutely. Well, it's well known, of course, that obstetricians are the most
Gifted.
rewarded, because the patients are not really sick, and they generally have a very happy outcome with a sense of closure, where there is that handover. Whereas psychiatrists notoriously have a very low chocolate quotient because the relationship is ongoing, hugely stigmatized, power differentials, and very rarely has a sense of closure. So, well, thank you for that insight, Mark. Now I'll be adding that to my store of things to think about.
So I'm going to, just to move things on, so you will have a chance to ask Dr. Gay some more questions after this next session, because she will be presenting.
Yeah, Kay and I, we're doing a double act.
Yes.
My Imperial hat on there.
Yeah. Thank you. So we're presenting from different perspectives now. I'm with my Imperial hat on, and Kay with her King's hat on, and we've got together to bring you 12 top tips for teaching medical humanities. Okay, we've slightly scripted because we've only got 10 minutes, which was...
I'll speak up. Tell me, just wave if you can't hear. Okay, so we'd like to share with you our joint learning. We wrote about 24 tips, and this is a big condensation of learning. My expertise comes from my previous project, so I designed and evaluated a humanities module for 400 students across 50 GP practices.
And I'm currently a course lead for an intercalated BSc in humanities, philosophy and law. I've been teaching medical humanities at Imperial for 15 years. Yes, so our first tip is that students actually relish the humanities because it offers something different. But in reality, unless you link it to clinical practice, both students and faculty do not tend to take it seriously. So it's really important to make that link explicit. And humanities approach authorizes all the sorts of learning outcomes that we love: building compassion, tolerance of ambiguity, leadership qualities, developing professional identity. But I advocate involving students in the conversation. So if you're going to incorporate humanities into your teaching, I find a really good idea is to ask the students why they think we are doing this today. So why are we using art to teach dermatology? Why have I asked you to read that poem? Why are we looking at the short story? Because by justifying it to themselves and to their peers, it's a lot more persuasive than us standing in the front and saying, you should be doing poetry because it gives you this, that, and the other. So that clinical relevance emerges, and you can supplement it, but it's really important to establish that.
So we did that by having both a clinician and a humanities expert always in the same room together. And I would say, to what we were talking about earlier, some students see passing their assessments as the objective of their studies. And for others who may be just about managing, humanities may be seen as an additional burden in their already stressed out world. We do, however, know that students that engage with humanities do better overall. And here's a set of feedback from a single afternoon. And students were asked to simply post up 3 words anonymously to sum up their experience. As you can see, the majority in green are engaged, many using the language of transformative learning, with words such as eye-opening, enlightening. The grey ones using mixed language, challenging, confusing, interesting but irrelevant. And a very small minority, we've got 3 here, totally unfair, pointless, and nuisance. And rather like Giskin, we tend to focus on that. So I would encourage you to use a frequency-weighted word cloud rather than just to get a better overall view of the value of your project. But we do need to attentive discontents, don't become obsessed.
So big up subjectivity. Objectivity is often celebrated in medicine, and subjectivity is viewed as being unreliable, but subjectivity is where it's really at. The person's lived experience, the patient's identity, their experiences, those are really important. And we can help students to interrogate the subjectivity of medical knowledge by opening up those questions about how we arrive at what comes out as true. It's not to say that facts are not true, but every fact has a series of subjective judgments where somebody has decided what's important. And one of the most powerful interventions we can make in medical education is to think about those subjective judgments. Bodies are made up of molecules, people are made up of stories.
So my one is around making friends and contacts. So I began this is Guy's Hospital somewhere down here at the bottom. I began my journey by literally just, literally figuratively and literally crossing the River Thames. And I turned up to talks given by other departments within the university, which was students' presentation of creative rapping. I attended a talk given at Imperial College by Giskin, which started this really. At each event I spoke to people who spoke to people who spoke to other people, and which is how I ended up getting joint funding, getting creative input from our dentistry department and our cultural institute and Professor Brian Hurwitz. That's how we got our sponsorship from the Doyle Park Foundation. And we were supported again and again by advocates, and our project was in danger of being shut down, and this would have also lacked academic authenticity unless we had these serious experts on board.
Okay, be realistic. I've got a top for this. So students who have not previously studied the humanities really find medical sociology almost impenetrable. So rather than giving primary sources like Foucault or Descartes, I recommend giving them far more accessible texts. So this book is fantastic for opening up those conversations about, it's The Diving Bell and the Butterfly by Jean-Dominique Baudy. He had locked-in syndrome. He dictated the whole book by the blinking of one eyelid. It's an amazing story. And this has our students thinking about the mind-body problem and subjective experience of illness in ways that giving them Foucault and Descartes would not. So I really recommend using popular text to catalyze talking about complex ideas.
So you're not going to make humanities experts in 3 seconds?
No.
My point is about making students feel safe if you're really going to realise the strengths that the humanities have to offer, students have to feel safe to both create, criticise and express themselves, their deepest, darkest thoughts. And we started by inviting students to be critical, to choose a topic they felt passionate about, preferably something they thought they weren't learning in other ways. And we used a form of feedback that's specific to the creative arts that came out of dance, I think. And it's called the critical response process to enable students to express themselves and to give and receive feedback safely.
Allow students to take some ownership of teaching. We have this Friday, it's called the FAD Club, Film and Book Club, where students take that week's topic, and in fact this was Wen Wei's idea. She's forgotten she's set this up, but we run with it. And the students then lead discussion for an hour based on a film and a book. And what's been fabulous is that they've both got an insight on how difficult it is to prepare teaching, so that's a win. But also it's been wonderful to see the way the creativity is filtered through to them. So here we have students on our graphic novel workshop that week. They baked gingerbread people and had us show how we might show pain on them. We had a pass the parcel for a health scandal. This guy's doing a rap that he improvised. And we have fantastic making cakes. This is an anatomically correct cake for one of our sessions. So allowing students to take ownership of teaching, if you can do that, that's a fantastic thing to do.
And this is a point that you brought up, that artistic and creative expression does not happen in a vacuum. We're social animals, and we create at our best when we know that we have an audience that will appreciate our work. So we had sponsored prizes for creativity, teamwork, quality, impact on clinical learning, and reflective writing. We set up an exhibition for students and their GP tutors and invited senior faculty to celebrate their successes.
Right, students do love choice, but they may feel overwhelmed by it. I've made a whole set of cards. In fact, I'm doing a workshop tomorrow on games where we've got more of these cards available. We'll be demonstrating them. But these just provide, they honour students' work, but they also provide examples of what students can do. And it helps them to be aspirational, but it's also not too intimidating. So having some ready-to-go ideas is a really good idea to show that you can do amazing things in a short amount of time with relatively few resources. Yes.
So this one is about your evaluation. Simple Likert scale, did I like it, isn't going to cut it. If you need to look for complex learning, you're going to have to use complex methods. So look up a limited evaluation, go and have a go at it. I think of not just the outcomes, but the processes, evaluating your processes with a view to improvement. And you would need to look for unintended as well as intended learning outcomes.
We have to be bold with our assessment. If you are going to ask students to do imaginative things, we have to think imaginatively about the assessment. We have to set an exam, but we have set an exam, 3-hour exam with just one question. So it really allows students the time and space to reflect on their learning. We also have an exhibition where we honour students' work. Neither Kay nor I actually assess students' actual creative outputs, but we assess the process that goes into it. So we require students to
assess the process.
Yeah.
The outputs assess the process.
That's exactly it. Thank you.
And finally, there is no single right way. If you read any other version of 12 tips, you will learn that the humanities has many schools of thought. You have the humanities of medicine, so there's an academic side of the humanities for medicine, that's what we're doing, clinical learning through humanities, and the therapeutic side, arts and health movements, the humanities as medicine. There's also a school of thought that says it shouldn't be fun. But we don't subscribe to that. It can be engaging, exciting, and it can be fun. Excellent. Thank you.
We did it in the time? Yes?
Great.
I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed the talk very much and very useful tips. On your first point, I have a sort of comment. The point was that we should make clear to the students the relevance of what we do to the medical education that they are receiving. Of course, there's a lot of truth in this, and I completely agree with it. On the other hand, sometimes I wonder, for example, when an engineering student comes to our class, we don't try to explain to them what is the relevance of reading a novel to the engineering education. I think there's something to be said about just being better educated by doing more reading, for example. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing. All I'm saying is maybe at the beginning of the course we can mention the relevance, maybe from time to time we remind them of that, but it's not as though we must design the whole thing as though everything must be directly relevant.
I think if we did it that way, it wouldn't be as educationally impactful. And what I think our point was actually just making the implicit explicit. So the way we did it, we didn't start off by telling students you need to do this. We made it explicit by making them write about, after the project, what they learned and how and why. So it's slightly different.
I mean, I think there's a big movement now for humanities to stand on its own 2 feet and not have to be an allied thing to everything else. But the fact is, if you're teaching a course and you want student buy-in, you can forget it unless you make it clinically relevant. We run a course, an arts workshop for dermatology. We used to hemorrhage students on the way to the VNA. But the minute we thought more carefully about how we framed the thing at the start of the session, and that was to be very explicit and actually have the consultant tell them why it was important to do, we found that we kept students on board. And also, you just go, field trip this afternoon, and you have buy-in. Whereas, okay, we're going to go and look at some statues of the VNA. Just doesn't cut it. So all of these things have to work together. But for student buy-in, relevance, I'm sad to say, I would love them to just come along because they felt they're going to come out a more rounded person. It doesn't exclude that, but you don't get student buy-in in the same way. I've just learned that the hard way.
Yes, thank you for your sharing. I think the tips that you shared are quite applicable for a culture that values humanities, like the learning of the application in the social cultural context. But how would you introduce like the concept of learning humanities in a culture that doesn't really value this kind of less practical and pragmatic?
I would call all of medicine that, well, sorry, no, undergraduate medicine, it seems to be very positivistic, particularly our educational methods. But
I think it's been very successful at LKC,
yeah.
doing the humanities. You could probably speak to that.
Yes, we will. In fact,
Okay.
Here we go.
Right, he's going to answer your question.
yeah, this is so. So I'm now switching from changing my hat from that of chair to that of speaker. And Lucy Richards and I will be presenting to you the curriculum as the medical humanities curriculum as I saw here in LKC. So it's just to give you a bit of a background. So the program was started about 5 to 6 years ago, actually, with a great deal of input from Giskin. So I hope we've embodied some of the key tips. I think much of what you said, I was thinking, oh, actually, we are doing those things. So we'll sort of faithfully help carry the torch. So it's originally developed by Harry Wu, who started out, he's a psychologist, and then came here to teach the medical humanities program. He was in based sort of double position in history here. And then he left and was taken over by Tanya Tierney, who runs the communication program for a couple of years. And then I've inherited it in the last year and have sort of joined the team. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of the rationales about these questions about how do we speak from the humanities to medicine and vice versa, how do we speak within medicine about the humanities, and how that affects the course, and then Lucy will talk about how we've integrated it into the curriculum. So, yeah, I'll not memorize these slides. So, yeah. So we'll probably, I mean, everyone's familiar with C.P. Snow's two cultures model, which demarcates these two discrete approaches between the natural sciences and the humanities. Humanities are subjective, and they help us understand and navigate the contours of experience and the interplay of meaning as we navigate our worlds. The power of metaphor to structure our relationships, ways in biopower structures our social identity. And similarly, by contrast, there's this notion that the sciences does the exact opposite. The role of the sciences is to get beyond the myopia of the human perception and see the natural world and processes that are going on. So they're looking at exactly two binary opposed junctures. And this kind of binary is true when you look at it from an epistemological perspective and how it is we know that we know. So we have these issues, there's these commonplaces in the sciences that if you can't measure it, it's not true. And if in the humanities, if you can measure it, it's not true. and the desire for complexity and diversity and ambiguity and the ability to navigate these flows and blends. And people contrast that with the sciences. Well, what I believe is actually what the medical humanities, it really takes us out of that binary model. And it's informed actually for me from medical anthropology and social and science and technology studies, who really understand in practice, actually, as humans, we're all constantly navigating these two worlds all the time. We're constantly deploying analytical or elusive, either logical or associative kind of models for thinking and for analyzing and deciding how to deal with a situation. And I really see that the medical humanities course is a way of instructing students how to get out of one particular box and become more comfortable. And I also want to break down the illusion, actually, that the medical humanities doesn't, and the humanities don't have analytical critical tools. We have specific clear structures: gender, power, class, race, language, which are good marker points for how to navigate your way through a situation. But the skills that you produce, it's not like learning the effects of a biochemical. And it's not like mastering a surgical procedure. These are tools which you use in life in its complexity. So it's hard to measure, it's hard to pin down. And this is kind of what we try to, in this course, make students become familiar with and get used to this kind of different mode of operating. So I want to lay that down, that I'm really fundamentally, we're looking at outside of the C.P. Snow model of two cultures and looking at how they come together, because I'm just about to talk about the differences now between humanistic and medical humanities learning. I mean, the ways in which a humanistic scholar trains students and trains in their own career is to read and analyze texts, right? Whether it's philosophy, linguistics, or literature or history, we're there to analyze texts and comment on them. And so it's very important to know their genealogy and their background. Yet what a clinician and their role, what we want them to be able to do is to communicate care, to communicate compassion in a context to people. And they don't need to know the background. So they don't need to know how Foucault leads into Judith Butler or to have read Lakoff and Johnson in order to understand metaphor and gender. They need applied cases. So next slide. So it's really instructing them that it's life is lived and how medicine interacts with that. And the key message I think that I hope to drive home is that medicine not only is a science, but it's an encultured form of knowledge. And these points, power, gender, class, and race. And these tools can help us navigate medical events and situations, how medicine constructs the subject, and how meaningfulness is produced. I'm conscious of time. Okay, so moving on. Oh great, this looks lovely, thanks. So what we've done is we've kind of inserted the classes into the curriculum, so they're married to the teaching block. So in cardiorespiratory, we talk about it's their first class, and they look at how medicine is in culture, the effect of the white coat. We study Byron Good's ethnography of Harvard Medical School, which discusses how people are in culture through different practices. It's really too much to go through in the time that we have. But each one, sort of, we try to draw a direct clinical relevance. We examine specific cases, and we stories, narratives, film, that are relevant to what they're already learning, so they can begin to see that the topics they're learning are humanistic and how people navigate them. One of the things that I notice in medical humanities generally is it tends to be very English language focused and talk about the two cultures as being medicine and non-medicine, right? Medicine and the rest. But in fact, here in Singapore, we're dealing with multiple cultures: English language, Hokkien, Mandarin, Malay, Tamil, and many others who don't even match the list. And all of the different subcultures here, the LGBTQ community, single mothers. How do you treat these different communities separately? So these, in these, so we use I use Chinese films as well as English films. We use Chinese poetry, and I'm gathering a list of kind of Southeast Asian films as well to use. So look at the next slide. Just to introduce you quickly before I tap off so we do a creative activity, the heart art. In the first session, they draw up about the notion of the heart of medicine. And we tell them, don't worry if you're not an artist. However, there is an assessment, because some people were just blowing it off. So that their piece should indicate thoughtful reflection on a subjective experience and cultural meaning in relation to medicine. Next slide. And so these are some of the examples. But we don't actually assess them on the basis of the quality of the art. They make beautiful work. We actually assess them on the quality of the reflection. So the prize winner for last year was this graphically very simple, but actually reflectively very complex. She's writing about the white coat and the purple coat. Few Men Can Reconcile. It's a poem by Tony Arce, which was one of his slides. And how this image captures the essence of how difficult it can be to achieve a good balance in giving clinical treatment. And there's two parts of the heart, the one coat with the white, the purple coat, the other with the white coat, describing the kind of the passion and burning to heal, and also the need for clinical detachment. And then she concludes by saying that someone wise once told her, be more human than a doctor, and that is something that she wants to remember for the rest of her life. So, okay.
So as part of the curriculum review here at LKC, we've started developing new learning outcomes for medical humanities. And at first it seemed quite an easy task, but actually it's turned out to be quite complex, and it's raised a lot of interesting issues. I think at the heart of the matter is, how does medical humanities make better doctors, and how do you then incorporate what's gained in the sessions into learning outcomes, which is what's been discussed earlier this afternoon. And why are robust learning outcomes important? Well, I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about the value of medical humanities. So we get excellent feedback consistently on medical humanities course at LKC, and in the literature you can see it's very well received by students. Those that teach it are very passionate about it and often see the profound impact it has on the students. But at the same time, there is less empirical evidence about the value of medical humanities than other areas of medicine. And with competitive pressure on the curriculum, especially somewhere like LKC, where it's a core part of the curriculum, you really need to have a strong educational underpinning to secure its place in the curriculum. And it also, even though the students very much enjoy the sessions, it's also very useful if they actually have an appreciation of the educational significance of the medical humanities curriculum. So our aim is to develop learning outcomes that are specific, accessible and meaningful. So as I mentioned, it's part of the curriculum review process with LKC and Imperial. We've also looked at learning outcomes at other international educational institutions. And medical humanities teaching takes on many different forms, whether it's a core part of an MBBS curriculum or a special study module, also intercalated degrees at Imperial or postgraduate courses. And we've also looked at medical humanities literature to identify the key themes that come up. So these are our findings. So these are the key elements we think are important when constructing learning outcomes for medical humanities. So in the bottom left are the tools, and these are obviously the same throughout the whole MBBS curriculum. So there's the institution house style for learning outcomes, which for LKC involves Bloom's taxonomy, as it does in many other places. And then with that, we've identified key elements which we think are important in the curriculum. So this is based on what's being taught in the curriculum, but also the themes that emerge in the literature. So these are cultural competence, cultural critical analysis, narrative attentiveness, creative thinking, empathy, and increasingly important, the concepts of resilience and reflective practice in prevention of burnout. These will then map to graduate outcomes, and of the 6 graduate outcomes that we use here, used in Singapore, the 3 that we think are most relevant are patient care, interpersonal and communication skills, and professionalism. And then there's the assessable elements. And this year, for the first time, an element of assessment has been brought into the curriculum, as Michael mentioned, and so the students' narrative and their piece of artwork are now assessed, and what we're looking at is the depth of reflection rather than any artistic brilliance. So these are the current draft of the learning outcomes, and they're still evolving all the time, but if we move on to questions, and if you do have any comments about these learning outcomes, we'd be very happy to hear them.
Looking at those learning outcomes, they absolutely resonate with what our students have learned. So they're obviously they're right, but we found the actual learning was emergent rather than defined, so we couldn't say you're going to learn this now. So what we actually ended up doing was giving them a list of learning outcomes and say, you show us which ones of these you have achieved through this project and how and why. It's very hard to say, well, now you're going to become culturally competent. But yeah.
So I find that's really, really impressive. The fact that at every stage, we're inserting some kind of narrative, some kind of humanistic reflection. I think coming from a school where you've got an established positivistic curriculum, often the insertion of humanities feels a little bit piecemeal. So kudos. I think part of this could be also because one can build that curriculum from scratch and also fight the corner for that. So that's what's really good. I don't know if that's how it happened.
No, I wasn't here when it was developed in its inception. You probably know more about it.
Well, I'm incredibly impressed. I agree with you. I came over 5 or 6 years ago. It started from an idea that this was important, and people have really followed through on it, which is just fantastic to see. So well done to you all. It is impressive. I totally agree with you.
Can I ask, the student asked a very good question, so do you think your question has been answered? She asked a question about whether, about the relevance of a thing in different cultures, I think is the best way to describe it.
I was wondering, because I feel that it's easier to introduce this concept of teaching humanities in a culture that's already kind of accepting towards and like receptive to exploring different ideas, but in a society that
You call it practical?
I guess it's like in a society that's a bit more restrictive and less liberal in a sense, because these things tend we see these ideas
less tangible.
Yeah, we see these ideas as less tangible, and we're more focused on the pragmatic side of things. And I think in a lot of for most of us, we feel that medical humanities, like the word humanities scares a lot of us, because we can't really relate the pragmatism, of learning medicine with humanities, because they seem to be two different ideas. And so, I guess building on Chen Lin's idea, like the fact that medical humanities is being taught is a good thing, but in Singapore, we find that it's difficult to accept it. And like the tips that were given, I think the 12 tips that were given just now, what I think some of us feel is that, how can these tips be applied to a society where it's more difficult to understand, or rather to accept humanities? And yeah, because those, I guess those tips do, those tips do work, like it's tested in like UK and stuff like that, where a culture is different, but can they be cross-applied to different cultures?
I absolutely hear what you're saying, that our biggest battle was, it was within the medical school, and it was with our assessments culture.
Talking about Kingsland,
Imperial, yeah, lovely, actually, fantastic. Really good, fantastic. Those complex assessments are fine, but we had just multiple choice and OSCE, and that was it. It was objective and structured and single best answer. We couldn't teach it, let alone assess it. So, yeah.
So if you don't mind, do you mind if we keep the session going past the break time by 5 or so minutes, because I don't want to keep the time of the next speaker. Then if we do, then we can take a couple more questions. Yeah?
So a very quick question with regards to, not a question, but I just want to ask, what year are you all in? Right, first year students, and I was wondering if that question would still be relevant when you're faced with a patient. And so what that got me thinking is it possible to do medical humanities education in the hospital context? Bring them into the hospital and conduct the medical humanities course. I don't know how you want to do it, but when you're faced with the situations in your face in reality, then maybe the humanity of it comes into your face.
So I can speak briefly to that. We've been thinking about inserting into, extending the humanities into the third and fourth year when students are having clinical clinical rounds, and also especially using reflective practice. And there's a mode that we're very curious about the implementation by Anne Holland, who I don't know if you saw her last summer, which came in May. But it's you go for a week and you have one particular question, you ask it and journal about it every single day. But how did I, how was I speaking today? And you keep asking it each day, and then, a few weeks later, and you do this in an encounter group and you share your results. You ask a different question, how was I listening? And encourage people to entrain the skill of being self-reflective in the moment on multiple contexts as opposed to on particular objects of reflection which happen in these kinds of courses. Got your hand raised, yes.
Hi, yes. It was just when you were talking about how we set up the course from scratch, because that was something that I was very much involved with. And I think we did take inspiration very much from Giskin's work at Imperial. And we had a chap called Harry Wu from Taiwan who was here initially. And we were really keen to do what we've done with other parts of the course, like the communication skills teaching and the science teaching, to try and integrate it across the different systems. I think one of the challenges we've had is that we don't have local Singaporean clinicians who have had the time or the inclination to engage with the course. And I think, that's not to say that there isn't interest there, but it's just that's not a priority. So I think I would love to see this rolled out through the 5 years, but it needs to have, I think, local clinicians to drive that forward.
Well, I'm a Singaporean clinician.
Sure, but you're part of our LKC faculty, because I think maybe we need to adopt you to lead our medical humanities course in the clinical years.
What you said resonates with me, because we have this thing called PBP, patient-based programs. First-year students going onto the wards and just talking to patients as human beings. Human to human, not medical student to disease, which is how they speak to patients in the third year. And it is actually there after 20 years. And I learned something that what I want and what the patient wants are different. I want to be the clever doctor to diagnose the disease and treat the disease. The patient just wants to hold life back. And these insights come into play when you have a fresh perspective, somebody who came into medicine to do good and hasn't been, flooded with all of this knowledge and stuff, and had the humanity beaten out of them by the time they hit the third year.
So in terms of, I'm so excited that this is such a stimulating conversation, but we have the final and really dynamic speaker, Michelle Chian from the School of Humanities from the Literature Department, who's going to be speaking to us about writing and the qualitative experience. And so let's welcome Michelle.
Hello. I'll try to make this quick. I know it's almost 5:30. Hi, I'm Michelle Chian. I started this project in order to raise public awareness about the importance of end-of-life conversations. But more specifically, I hope this project, I hope this research solves two problems. The first problem, on the one hand, there are doctors out there who find it difficult to tell their patients that they are dying, and that the treatment options available to them have very limited curative potential. And then there are terminally ill patients who are reliant on their doctors because they value their doctor's expertise, and so they would accept treatment recommendations such as chemotherapy, experimental drugs with unknown side effects, or life-sustaining treatments, without fully understanding the extent of qualitative time that they are trading off for quantitative time. Now, what's the difference between qualitative time and quantitative time? I think it's very difficult to understand what one is trading off without knowing what's the difference between the two. And I think this is where stories of the dying come in. So stories of the dying come in not only to clarify the difference between the two, but also to inform the design of a simple model for patients to initiate the difficult conversation instead of relying on their doctors. So the methodology is very faithful to my discipline, which is literature. So I differentiate how time is quantitatively and qualitatively experienced by exploring the central theme of each story and its development, analyzing the structure of each narrative, and paying close attention to how life events are ordered and related to each other, then employ the findings to inform the model's design. But before I go on, I'd like to state that I changed the title of this presentation from End-of-Life Memoirs to Stories of the Dying, because I recently managed to convince a colleague to share about 60 local stories of the dying with me. So this is a new development, so I thought I should just change it to Stories of the Dying instead of just memoirs. But really, memoirs got me thinking about the difference between quantitative time and qualitative time. So what is quantitative time? It is clock time, so we see our lives as past, present, future, going in a straight line, linearity. But upon a terminal diagnosis, there's a disruption of this linearity. And the impulse to try anything under the sun in order to get rid of this aberrance is inextricably linked to our perception of time as singularly quantifiable. But the truth of the matter is, time is experienced as dual, both quantitative and qualitative. Now, what is qualitative time? Will I miss what I don't even know? We schedule our day around clock time, quantitative time, and so clock time is always at the foreground of our consciousness. But what's going on in the background is really qualitative time. So will I miss it? Yes, you will. Qualitative time, because you know what it is. It is an intensity. In Paul Kalanithi's When Breath Becomes Air, a very famous, popular memoir now, he gives us a very good example of what intensity is. So it's when 2 hours can feel like a minute. But conversely, a minute can also feel like an eternity. How? Memory, events, experience are arrested in qualitative time. And so qualitative time is essentially constituted by memorable events that mark one's roles as best friend, daughter, son, spouse, parent, sibling. It is non-linear because memories allow us to revisit it over and over again. And so, in a nutshell, qualitative time is made up of events and people that make one's life meaningful. Now, in many of these stories, in most of these stories, really, there is a shift of perspective from quantitative time, the initial experience of time as being disrupted by the terminal illness, to a focus on the qualitative experience of time. And how is this done? This is facilitated by writing, because writing allows for the process of reconstructing a life narrative, which affords the terminally ill writer an opportunity to identify events and people that make one's life meaningful, and how one would like to continue to live out a personal story. Now, these are important points. Why? Because end-of-life conversations aim to elicit these answers from patients as well. So end-of-life conversations ask what is most important to an individual, how one would like to continue to live out the personal story, and how much one is willing to go through to prolong life. But not everyone has the opportunity to have an end-of-life conversation. And not everyone is a writer who's capable of writing a memoir. So what do you do when we're going back to the first question that I posed, the first problem I posed. What do we do when I have a doctor who doesn't know when is the best time, who can't gauge when's the best time to initiate an end-of-life conversation? What do I do if my family members are reluctant to have this conversation with me, or is preventing the doctors from having a conversation with me because
I don't want, because my family members do not wish to be looked upon as if they are giving up on me by having this end-of-life conversation. So what do I do as a competent patient with the mental capacity to decide how I would like to continue to live out my personal story, and to decide how much I'm willing to go through to prolong life? I think there are patients out there who would like to ask these questions, but they do not, because they do not have the medical expertise, so they don't know how to begin asking these questions. So this is a very fun inversion of the ask, tell, ask feedback model. So instead of ask, tell, ask, it's tell, ask, tell. It's very simple. It in no way substitutes the end-of-life conversations, because those conversations are usually made up of a comprehensive list of questions. But it is a conversation starter. The first tell, and it's very easy with no medical and no legal jargons at all, so that people like my parents, my grandparents can use them. So the first tell is really telling caregivers and healthcare professionals what's most important to one. These are not complex things. They can be as simple as the desire to retain one's lucidity for as long as possible, so that one can continue to communicate with one's loved ones, to be pain-free, or to even retain one's appetite for as long as possible, because food is somebody's life, a patient's life. Then the second part, ask, is really asking healthcare professionals and their doctors mainly about treatment options that can match what's most important to him or her. And then the final tell is the negotiation part. It's important because not all treatments can perfectly be tailored to what a patient finds is most important to her or him. So this part, this final tell, is patient considers and tells caregivers trade-offs she or he is willing to make in order to prolong life. So this is a model, a very easy to remember model, and I kind of tested it on my students who came to see me at the Singapore Writers Festival. So a few days after the festival, I met them and I was like, do you remember about the models? They were like, yeah, tell us, right? I was like, okay, cool. So they remember it, so it's easy to remember. And hopefully this will then initiate the conversation. It will indicate to the physicians and the loved ones that this patient, this competent patient who wishes to be more actively involved in completing the rest of her personal story, hopefully this will indicate that she's willing, she's ready for a more comprehensive list of questions in the end-of-life questionnaires or booklets. So in conclusion, end-of-life stories reveal a crucial shift from the initial perception of time as disrupted linearity to a qualitative temporal experience as the writer rounds out the personal story and brings focus to what's most important and meaningful to the individual. The Tell Us Tell model aims to initiate and facilitate this shift of focus in competent patients, thereby empowering them to be actively involved in deciding how they would like to live out their personal story. Thank you. Yes, hi.
I really love your model. So I actually went to palliative care and specialist oncology unit, and I often really struggle with clinicians who feel like giving the end of life discussion is giving up hope on that patient. How do you find, especially those kind of specialities that often are dealing with people on a real precipice, how do you think you can engage with them in using it? Because that's often it's their own personal barrier. Is there anything you come across before you seem to involve?
Engaging with the patients or with
the professional?
The professionals. Yeah, so one reason I was really excited to come here is to meet healthcare professionals and to really ask you about how would you feel if a patient initiated such a conversation with you. Is it better for you, or do you find that it's a nuisance? I don't really want to deal with that. How do you guys feel about the model? Because I'm not a doctor, So my experience is from my family's members' experience with cancer, with dying. So I, as a humanities scholar, I really come from the perception of a patient's family member. So yeah, why don't you guys share with me what do you think about this model? It's just an idea.
I think this is I call that what doctors do. Tell for the patients, ask for the doctor, and that's normally the sort of conversation we have. We say, well, these are the options. Well, first of all, you say, what do you want out of life? What do you want out of such and such? And then these are what we can do for you. And so it is kind of tell ourselves for the patient and ask the last.
Yeah, but would it be like shocking if a patient initiated it instead of you?
It depends on the doctor.
Yeah.
And depends on the patient. Some patients don't know.
Yeah, and as I was working on this research, I realized increasingly that I had to narrow down the parameters, such as the patient has to be the competent patient, and then now that I'm working on local stories of the dying, I'm like narrowing it down even further. So the parameters are narrowing, but the focus is becoming clearer. So that's interesting. Yeah. Yes. Oh.
So I thought all the presentations were absolutely fascinating and really inspiring. And I particularly liked this one coming at the end because I think it really encapsulates the operationalisation of some of the stuff that you've been talking about. There was actually, just to answer your question, there was actually a report out from the Royal College of Physicians about 3-4 weeks ago, possibly now, time flies, exactly touching on what you're asking the audience, so you might want to have a look at that. The only thing, so I have always felt that a thule Rwanda, nobody should be accepted into medical school without having first, that should be one of the qualifying questions, have you read a thule Rwanda? And one of the things that I think this work has huge implications in terms of addressing the resource issues that are facing health services globally. And I don't know how you could put a research project in place to look at how many resources are saved because medical humanities were embedded from the outset within undergraduate curriculum. Because I think it would be huge, because actually you would equip people to be able to have these conversations and actually stop intervening and rolling out intensive interventions that are completely inappropriate and not in the best interests of the patient. Rant over.
One more question or round. Yes.
I'm just curious about the 60 end-of-life stories that you had. Whether in any of them, the patient narratives, whether patients wrote about the role of the doctor or saw the doctor as part of their narrative.
That's a good question. I would like to find out too. So I mentioned that I just acquired these 60 stories because these are not my data. They're from Professor Andy Ho. He's also from NTU Psychology Department. He's very generously agreed to share those stories with me. Singaporeans don't write a lot of memoirs, so we don't have that kind of memoirs to look at. So far, all I've been looking at are memoirs written by international writers. So I'm very glad to get him. I'm very glad that he agreed to share them with me. So this is a work in progress, really, and I'm very excited to see what I can find. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Well, I want to hamper everybody's progress towards food. So with no further ado, I think we should take Giskin's cue and offer our thanks to all the speakers.